Blood stained the melting spring snow as Carina, a towering grizzly bear, prowled restlessly near the forsaken mining shaft. Her massive frame cast a shadow over the uneven ground, her powerful claws, formidable weapons capable of shredding any foe, scraping uselessly against the iron bars that imprisoned her cubs. For 3 relentless days, she had waged a war against time, exhaustion, and despair. Her once pristine chestnut fur, a badge of her strength, now hung in matted clumps, streaked with mud and darkened by her own blood, spilled in countless futile attempts to breach the barrier. The crisp mountain wind carried the faint, frightened whimpers of her cubs from the shaft's depths, each sound slicing through her like a blade, igniting a primal fury that drove her to hurl herself against the rusted metal again and again. Her broad shoulders bore deep, jagged gashes from forcing her bulk through impossibly tight crevices, and her paws, once sure and steady, were raw and bleeding from clawing at the unyielding earth. Yet this physical torment was a mere whisper compared to the suffocating terror of losing her babies, a fear that gnawed at her soul with every passing moment. Spring had swept into the mountains earlier than usual, softening the frozen landscape with trickles of meltwater and the first green shoots. The abandoned mine, a relic of human greed long forgotten, had stood silent until the winter's thaw destabilized its entrance. Carina's cubs, Tyner and Sylvie, just 4 months old and brimming with the reckless curiosity of youth, had ventured too close while she guided them through their first lessons in foraging, sniffing out roots and overturning stones for grubs. She had turned her back for only a moment, her attention caught by a distant rustle, when the rotting wooden supports groaned and gave way beneath their tiny paws. The collapse was sudden, a roar of earth and timber that sent them tumbling into the darkness below. Only the ancient metal grating, now twisted and partially caved in, had spared them a deeper fall into the mountain's belly, leaving them trapped in a cold, shadowed prison. As the sun rose on the 4th day, painting the peaks in hues of gold and amber, Carina's movements grew sluggish, her once fluid grace dulled by exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at her insides, a relentless ache she ignored. She hadn't eaten since the cubs vanished into the shaft, refusing to stray from their side for more than a fleeting minute to lap at a nearby stream or snatch a hasty bite of berries. Her powerful body, already lean from months of nursing Tyner and Sylvie through the harsh winter, teetered on the edge of collapse. The distant clamor of human activity floated up the mountainside, a clatter of tools, the murmur of voices, the faint crackle of a fire. Every instinct in her roared to retreat, to melt into the wilderness where she belonged. Humans were harbingers of death, guns that barked with lethal fire, traps that snapped shut with cruel precision, pain that lingered in old scars crisscrossing her flank from near-fatal encounters in her younger years. She had learned to fear them early, to keep her distance, to trust only the solitude of the forest. Yet as another weak, trembling cry drifted from the shaft, a shift stirred deep within her primal mind. Maternal love, raw and unyielding, began to wrestle with generations of ingrained dread. From shadowed perches high above human trails, Carina had watched them, strange, upright creatures who bent the world to their will. She had seen them erect shelters from felled trees, carve paths through stone, and wield tools that reshaped the earth itself. Their ways were alien, their power incomprehensible to her bare senses. Yet in her desperation, a dangerous seed took root. If her strength, her claws, her bulk, her ferocity could not tear through the metal and free her cubs, perhaps human ingenuity could. The thought was a betrayal of everything she knew, a spark of madness born from a mother's breaking heart. Carina raised her head, nostrils flaring as she tasted the wind. The human scent sharpened, mingling with the acrid tang of wood smoke wafting from a cabin nestled in the valley below. A place she had circled wide around for years, its presence a warning etched into her wanderings. To approach it was to court annihilation. They might spot her lumbering form and end her with a single shot, leaving Tyner and Sylvie to waste away in their tomb. But to remain here, clawing at the unyielding bars, was to watch their voices grow fainter until they stilled forever. Nature had not forged her for this choice. Every lesson of survival, every whisper of instinct, screamed at her to protect herself, to flee the humans and live to bear another litter. Yet the love for her cubs burned brighter, fiercer than any law of the wild. Standing atop the snowy slope, her gaze fixed on the distant cabin, she made a decision that defied the very fiber of her being. With one last, lingering look at the shaft's jagged mouth, she began her descent, each step deliberate, each breath a silent vow. Blood dripped from her wounds, dotting the snow with crimson markers as she moved toward her most feared enemy, gambling her life on the slimmest thread of hope that a human might understand her need. She did not know if she trudged toward her own end, only that she had tried every claw, every roar, every ounce of her might, and her cub's time was running out. In the wild, survival was a solitary creed, but Carina had learned a truth beyond its bounds. Sometimes, a mother must risk everything, even her own existence, to save her children. As she wove through the awakening forest, her massive silhouette a testament to both raw power and fragile hope, she carried with her the most potent force in nature, a mother's love. The journey down the mountain demanded every shred of her fading strength. Her colossal body, depleted by days without sustenance, moved with a cautious precision that belied her size, her paws sinking into the softening snow with each measured step. Each stride pulled her further from Tyner and Sylvie, their distant cries growing fainter, a fading echo that clawed at her resolve. Morning mist draped the valley in a ghostly shroud, half concealing the cabin of a hunter named Tharvin, its chimney trailing a thin ribbon of smoke into the pale sky. Carina's keen nose twitched as it caught the fresh scent of wolf tracks cutting across her path, sharp, musky traces of a pack on the move. Under normal moons, no wolf would dare challenge her. Her roar alone could scatter them, her claws rend their hides. But now, weakened and worn, she was no longer the invincible queen of the ridge. A confrontation could cripple her, delay her mission, and she couldn't afford the risk. She altered her course, veering onto a longer, winding route through dense undergrowth, thorny brambles and tangled vines that snagged at her fur and scraped her wounds anew. Her breaths came in labored rasps, clouds of vapor blooming in the cool spring air. The gashes on her shoulders had crusted over, stiffening with each flex of muscle, and flakes of dried blood crumbled free with every motion. Yet she pressed forward, her determination a quiet fire burning in her amber eyes. Years of skirting human settlements had sharpened her awareness of their rhythms, their comings and goings, the boundaries they claimed with their scents and sounds. She had memorized the trails to avoid, the hollows where their traps lay hidden, the hours when their voices fell silent. Now, she turned that hard-earned knowledge against itself, using it not to flee but to seek them out. Every few paces, she halted, ears swiveling back toward the shaft, straining for her cub's cries. The silences between their calls stretched longer, each pause a dagger to her heart, urging her to hasten beyond what caution permitted. She knew leaving them alone left them defenseless. Foxes with their sly jaws, coyotes with their cunning, or other predators might catch the scent of their distress and circle closer. The thought fueled her, driving her weary limbs onward despite the exhaustion that weighed her bones like stone. As she drew nearer to Tharvin's cabin, the human scent swelled. Gun oil sharp and metallic, smoke thick with charred pine, leather worn and earthy. Each whiff triggered a surge of panic she fought to smother, her muscles trembling with the effort of suppressing her instinct to bolt. A sudden bang erupted from the cabin. A door slamming, perhaps, or a log dropped, and her resolve nearly shattered. She dropped low, flattening herself into the underbrush, her heart pounding so fiercely it shook her massive frame. Through the gaps in the foliage, she saw Tharvin emerge, a broad-shouldered figure with an axe gripped in calloused hands, striding toward a woodpile stacked against the cabin's weathered wall. Carina's claws dug deep into the earth, anchoring her as she wrestled with the terror screaming through her veins. Every fiber of her being cried danger, yet the image of Tyner and Sylvie, trapped and weakening, rooted her in place. She needed this human to understand her plight, but one wrong move could trade salvation for a bullet. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her hiding spot, her silhouette breaking the line of shadows. The morning sun spilled across her, illuminating the raw cost of her rescue attempts. Bloodied fur, torn flesh, a body battered by desperation. She stood to her full height, a natural design meant to intimidate, to send lesser creatures scurrying. But now, she willed herself to appear unthreatening, a plea against her own nature. Tharvan froze mid-stride, his hand twitching toward the cabin where, she knew, a rifle waited. Karina took a step forward, then another, her movements stiff with pain, each shift of her weight a testament to her wounds. She kept her head bowed low, fighting the generations of instinct that demanded she either charge with bared teeth or vanish into the trees. A low whimper escaped her throat, a sound she'd never uttered in the presence of humans, a vulnerable note born of anguish rather than aggression. Tharvan's scent shifted, rippling from surprise to fear, then settling into a wary confusion. He remained still, perhaps sensing that her behavior defied everything he understood about bears, creatures of fury and solitude, not supplicants before humankind. She took another tentative step, then sat heavily, exposing her blood-streaked shoulders and the shredded pads of her paws. Time stretched thin between them, a fragile thread taut with unspoken stakes. Karina waited, each second away from her cubs an agony she could barely endure. She needed him to see, to comprehend her silent cry for aid. Rising once more, she took 2 deliberate steps toward the shaft, then turned her head to meet his gaze. The gesture was a wrenching betrayal of survival, turning her back on a human, leaving herself open to attack. When Tharvan didn't follow, she repeated the motion. Step, turn, wait. Step, turn, wait. Each repetition carried her further from the cabin, a desperate hope that he would trail her up the mountain. Her heart thundered in her chest, ears pricked for the fatal crack of a rifle. Yet she continued her mime, knowing Tyner and Sylvie's lives hung on this fragile thread. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her focus. Another human, Lasara, ascending the trail toward the cabin, his boots crunching through the snow. Karina's muscles coiled, poised to melt into the forest's embrace. For a fleeting moment, she teetered between fear and determination, her body trembling with the urge to flee. But the memory of her cub's weakening cries surged through her, anchoring her to the spot, though every nerve shrieked for escape. This was the crucible. One human might listen, might see her need, but 2 could deem her a threat too great to spare. As Lasara crested the rise, his lean form clad in furs, Karina made her most perilous choice. She stayed, defying the instincts that had kept her alive through seasons of danger, staking her life on the faint chance these humans might look past their fear to recognize a mother's desperate plea. Lasara's arrival sparked a storm of reactions. He raised his rifle with a shout, the barrel glinting in the sunlight, a warning born of reflex. Tharvan lifted his hands, his voice low and steady, calling for calm, his eyes still locked on Karina, intrigued by her strange stillness. She remained seated, her whole body quaking with the effort of suppressing her natural urge to flee or fight. Blood continued to seep from her wounds, pooling in dark patches against the white snow, a stark testament to her ordeal. Her eyes, usually fierce and unyielding, held an intelligence that snagged Tharvan's attention. He had crossed paths with many bears in his years roaming these wilds, hunters of instinct, driven by hunger or rage, but never one that sat before him like this, her posture radiating exhaustion and a quiet, desperate intent rather than menace. Lasara fired a warning shot into the sky, the crack reverberating through the valley, sending a flock of birds exploding from the treetops in a flurry of wings. Karina flinched, her ears flattening, but she did not run. Instead, she lowered herself further, pressing her belly into the snow, a display of submission so alien to her kind, a predator forged by nature to dominate, not to yield. She understood that making herself vulnerable before armed humans might invite death, but the thought of Tyner and Sylvie, their small bodies growing colder in the dark, lent her a courage that transcended fear. Rising once more, she moved several steps toward the shaft and glanced back at the humans. When they didn't follow, she edged closer, each approach bringing her within easy range of their weapons. Yet she persisted. She bent her head, seizing a fallen branch in her teeth, then dropped it at the clearing's edge, a gesture almost pleading, like a hound seeking play, but her eyes carried a depth of urgency that spoke of a far graver need. Tharvan took a step forward, his movement slow and deliberate, testing the air between them. Carina backed away slightly, maintaining a careful distance, then repeated her motion toward the mountain, adding a soft moan that trembled with distress. Almost a cry, a sound that pierced the stillness and reached even Lasara, who lowered his rifle a fraction, his brow furrowing as he sensed something profound unfolding. Tharvan, seasoned by years of tracking and hunting, had honed a knack for reading the wild's subtle cues. He noted how Carina favored her right side, how her fur was matted not from battle but from squeezing through tight confines, how her gaze kept darting back toward the mountain with an anxiety that went beyond mere instinct. Bears were clever, yes, but this level of deliberate communication, this pleading, was extraordinary, a riddle he couldn't yet unravel. Another shot rang out as a third hunter, Vexen, drawn by the commotion, burst from the forest's edge, his heavy boots snapping twigs beneath him. Carina stood her ground, though her legs shook with a cocktail of fear and fatigue, her massive form surrounded now by 3 armed figures. Yet she made no move to charge, no snarl of defiance. Instead, she carefully lay down, stretching her neck to expose her throat. The ultimate act of surrender, a gesture so stark it silenced the wind itself. This, more than anything, convinced Tharvan that something was terribly wrong. Nature hadn't sculpted bears to behave this way. Every rule of survival dictated she should either lash out with lethal force or vanish into the undergrowth when cornered by humans with guns. Yet here she was, this colossal creature, deliberately bearing her vulnerability, trying again and again to convey a message of desperate importance. Carina's next move shattered the final barrier between them. She approached the woodpile near the cabin, her claws glinting as she carefully hooked a single log, dragging it with measured restraint. A feat of control that showcased her remarkable intelligence. Too much force would scatter the pile, too little would fail to move it, but she found the balance, pulling the log a few feet toward the mountain trail before turning back to the hunters with eyes that pleaded for understanding. In that moment, a spark of realization flared in Tharvan's weathered face. This bear needed help, help that demanded human tools. The way she kept urging them up the mountain, her obvious injuries from clawing or squeezing into something, her relentless persistence despite the danger. All of it suddenly aligned into a clear, astonishing truth. Tharvan spoke softly to Lasara and Vexen, his voice a murmur beneath the wind, explaining his theory as Carina watched intently, her ears twitching to catch their tones, her gaze reading their stances as they lowered their weapons. When Tharvan took a cautious step toward the mountain trail, her entire bearing shifted, hope flickered in her posture, a subtle lift of her head. She rose quickly, taking several steps in that direction. She had done it, against every odd, defying every natural law etched into her bones. She had made humans understand her need. As the hunters gathered a few tools from the cabin, crowbars, ropes, a small axe, Carina fought her final battle against instinct. Every fiber of her screamed to run while she had the chance, to vanish into the safety of the wild before their mercy turned to menace. But she waited, trembling with exhaustion and fear, knowing her cubs' lives depended on these humans following her up the mountain. She would not fail them now. The journey back up the mountain became a delicate dance between urgency and caution, a fragile alliance tested with every step. Carina set a pace that pushed her battered body to its limits, her breaths heaving as she climbed. Yet she kept it slow enough for the hunters to follow, their boots crunching behind her in the snow. Every few strides, she turned her head, her amber eyes scanning their progress, anxiety spiking when they fell too far behind. Time was a merciless foe, slipping away with each heartbeat. Yet she knew rushing might spook them into abandoning her. Her massive frame, once a powerhouse of strength and boundless energy, now moved with visible strain, muscles quivering, wounds weeping fresh blood that left a sporadic trail of red against the white expanse. The trek uphill taxed her depleted reserves, draining the last embers of her endurance. But the sound of Tyner and Sylvie's cries, growing stronger as they neared, fueled her faltering steps with a mother's unyielding will. Tharvan, the one who had first glimpsed her plea, kept Lysara and Vexen calm with quiet words of reassurance. His voice a steady thread weaving through the tension. Karina noted how he maintained a respectful distance, close enough to follow her lead, far enough to signal he understood the danger she still posed. Despite her weakened state, she remained a grizzly bear, a force of nature capable of killing with a single swipe of her paw if provoked. This mutual acknowledgement of each other's lethal potential formed the bedrock of their tenuous trust, a silent pact forged in the shadow of the peaks. When they reached a narrow ravine, the path squeezed tight by jutting rocks, Karina faced another test of her resolve. The passage forced them closer together, the human scent, sweat, leather, steel, flooding her nostrils with signals of danger that set her nerves ablaze. Her muscles bunched instinctively, ready to defend herself in the confined space, her claws flexing against the stone. Yet she forced herself forward, step by agonizing step, even as the hunters' breaths quickened behind her, their own wariness palpable in the air. A series of distressed squeals echoed down from above, sharp and piercing, sending Karina into a frenzy of worry. She surged forward several paces, her massive form lurching with sudden speed, before catching herself mid-stride, remembering her desperate need to keep the humans with her. The conflict played across her features, her protective instincts clashing with the necessity of this alliance, her muzzle wrinkling as she fought to balance the two. She turned back, whimpering softly, her eyes pleading with the hunters to hurry, to match her urgency. The physical toll of the past days grew starkly apparent as they climbed higher. Her movements lost their fluidity, each step a conscious effort, her broad chest heaving with labored breaths. Twice she stumbled on loose rocks, her exhaustion betraying her once perfect balance, her paws slipping before she caught herself. Yet each time, she recovered, driven by a determination that transcended the limits of her flesh, a fire that burned beyond what her body could sustain. Tharvin watched her with growing admiration, his weathered face softening as he recognized the incredible sacrifice this proud creature was making. Each time she paused to let them catch up, she exposed herself to potential attack. Every instance she chose trust over flight demonstrated a level of intelligence and maternal devotion that defied all he'd been taught about the wild. As they neared the shaft, Karina's behavior shifted subtly, her body language a mix of mounting anxiety and the faint glimmer of relief at nearing her cubs. The sound of their cries grew clearer, cutting through the wind, and the hunters finally grasped the full weight of the crisis driving her. Their pace quickened voluntarily, no longer needing her guidance to sense the destination ahead. At a steep section requiring single-file passage, Karina faced her ultimate test of trust. She would have to let the humans walk directly behind her, placing herself in a position of complete vulnerability, her back exposed to their weapons. For a long moment, she stood frozen, instinct warring with necessity, her massive head swinging as she weighed the risk. The cries of Tyner and Sylvie from above tipped the scales. She began climbing, bearing her back to the armed hunters, gambling everything on the fragile understanding they'd built. Moved by her incredible display of courage, the hunters quietly stowed their rifles on their backs, a gesture of faith mirroring hers. Karina sensed this shift, her muscles relaxing slightly, her movements growing more natural despite the exhaustion dragging at her limbs. As they crested the final ridge before the shaft, she paused, turning to face the hunters fully for the first time since leaving the cabin. Her eyes, intelligent and desperate, met theirs directly, a raw connection that blurred the boundary between wild beast and human soul. In that moment, they saw not a dangerous predator, but a mother who had risked everything, broken every natural law, and placed her life in the hands of her enemies to save her children. The cubs' cries grew more excited, sensing her nearness, their small voices rising in a chorus of recognition. Karina turned toward the sound, then glanced back one final time at her human allies. They had followed her this far, but the hardest part still loomed ahead. The rescue would demand tools and human cunning, but also a trust that might never have existed between their kinds before. The final approach to the shaft unveiled the full tragedy of the situation. Tyner and Sylvie, their black fur dulled by dust and grime from the collapsed tunnel, huddled together behind the rusted metal grating. their tiny forms dwarfed by the jagged stone walls. Their cries turned frantic at the sight of Carina, their paws stretching through the bars in desperate bids to reach her, claws scraping against the iron. She rushed forward, pressing her bulk against the barrier, her muzzle nudging through the gaps as she tried to comfort them with soft grunts and the warmth of her breath. The hunters, Tharvin, Lysara, and Vexen, assessed the scene with growing concern, their faces tightening as they took in the details. The mine entrance had collapsed significantly, leaving only a narrow opening framed by old timber supports that creaked ominously under the weight of loose rock overhead. The metal grating, once installed to keep animals out, now held the cubs captive in a space barely large enough for them to turn, its edges fused to the frame by years of rust, rendering simple removal impossible. When Tharvin approached with his tools, a crowbar and a small saw, the air thickened with tension. Carina's instincts flared, her cub's distressed squeals igniting every protective fiber in her body. She rose to her full height, a towering figure of wild fear flashing in her eyes, her lips curling back in a momentary snarl. Tharvin froze, tools in hand, his breath catching as he realized these next moments would decide everything. Life or death, trust or tragedy. With tremendous effort, Carina forced herself to back away, her massive frame trembling with the need to shield her young, her claws scoring the earth as she retreated. The rescue began with a careful assessment. The hunters worked to stabilize the crumbling entrance, propping the timbers with rocks and wedging the crowbar to test the structure, aware that one wrong move could trigger another collapse, burying the cubs beneath tons of stone. Carina watched their every motion, her body tense with anxiety, her ears twitching at each clink of metal or shift of rubble. Each time Tyner or Sylvie cried out in fear of the humans' proximity, she fought the urge to charge, her trust in these former enemies tested with every whimper and scared squeal that pierced the air. An unexpected role emerged for her amid the chaos. Her cubs, terrified by the strangers and the strange clatter of tools, began to panic, thrashing in their tight prison, their small bodies risking injury against the grating's sharp edges. Understanding the danger, Carina positioned herself where they could see her clearly, her bulk a reassuring silhouette against the daylight. She began making soft grunting sounds, the same comforting noises she'd used when they were newborns nestled against her in their den, her voice a steady anchor that calmed their flailing enough for the rescue to proceed. The work proved more grueling than anticipated. Rust had welded the grating's hinges into a solid mass, forcing the hunters to cut through the metal itself with the saw. Each screech of blade against iron set Carina's teeth on edge, her ears flattening as the sound reverberated through the shaft. She paced anxiously, staying close enough to soothe her cubs with her presence, but far enough to give the humans room to maneuver. A delicate balance that demanded incredible restraint, especially when sparks from the tools flew too close to Tyner and Sylvie, glinting dangerously near their fragile forms. A heart-stopping moment came when one of the support beams shifted under the strain, sending a shower of rocks cascading into the opening. The cubs screamed in terror, their high-pitched wails cutting through the clamor, and Carina lunged forward instinctively, her massive paws pounding the ground. She caught herself mere feet from the hunters, her powerful muscles quivering with restrained force, her breath heaving in clouds of vapor. The humans had dropped their tools, hands darting toward their rifles in reflex, but Carina forced herself to retreat, her head lowering as she chose trust over terror once more. Tharvin raised a hand, signaling Lysara and Vexen to stand down, his eyes locked on her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They returned to their task, sweat beading on their brows as hours stretched on, exhaustion creeping into their movements. Carina's wounds had reopened from her constant pacing, fresh blood mingling with the old, staining the snow in uneven patches, yet she remained vigilant, alternating between comforting her cubs with low rumbles and watching the rescue unfold, her body swaying with fatigue but refusing to yield while her young remained trapped. The final phase of the rescue proved the most perilous. The grating had been cut away, its jagged remnants pried free, but the opening remained partially blocked by a tangle of debris, broken timber and loose stone that the cubs, weakened from their ordeal, couldn't navigate alone. They needed help to climb out, meaning the hunters would have to reach into the shaft, exposing themselves completely to Karina's unpredictable might. It was the ultimate test of the trust they'd forged. She watched as Tharvan lay flat on his stomach, his broad frame pressed against the cold earth, reaching into the darkness toward her frightened cubs. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to attack, to drive away this threat to her young with a roar and a swipe of her claws. Instead, she pressed closer to the opening, rumbling reassurances to Tyner and Sylvie, her presence coaxing them toward Tharvan's outstretched hands. One by one, the cubs were lifted to safety. First Tyner, his small body trembling as Tharvan's calloused fingers closed gently around him. Then Sylvie, her dusty fur catching the sunlight as she emerged. Each time a human touched her precious babies, Karina's anxiety spiked visibly. Her ears twitched, her muscles tensed, her breath hitched. Yet she held steady, understanding that these hands, once symbols of danger, were now her cub's salvation. She fought against generations of instinct, against every natural law that demanded she defend her young from human touch, her amber eyes flickering between fear and fragile hope. When Sylvie finally tumbled free into the snow, Karina's restraint broke. Not in anger, but in a flood of love. She rushed forward, her movements gentle despite her size, gathering Tyner and Sylvie to her chest, her muzzle brushing over them as she checked for injuries, her tongue rasping softly against their fur. One eye remained on the hunters, wary but grateful, as they backed away respectfully, giving the family space for their reunion. The humans stood in silence, witnesses to something extraordinary. A mother's love so powerful it had bridged the ancient chasm between human and bear, a divide carved by centuries of fear and bloodshed. In the fading light of the spring day, Karina nuzzled her rescued cubs, washing the dust from their coats with careful licks, her massive body curling around them protectively, a living shield between her precious ones and the world beyond. Though her wounds still bled, seeping into the snow, and exhaustion threatened to drag her into oblivion, her eyes shone with a quiet triumph. Her desperate gamble, breaking every rule of survival she'd ever known, had succeeded. Tyner and Sylvie, weak from their entrapment but otherwise unharmed, pressed against her warm fur, their earlier terror giving way to soft whimpers of contentment as they nursed for the first time in days, their small mouths tugging eagerly at her. She endured the pain of their feeding, knowing they needed strength for the journey ahead. Her own hunger and injuries would have to wait, secondary to their survival. The price of trusting humans had been steep. Her body bore new scars that would never fully fade, testaments to her solitary struggle against the shaft, claw marks and abrasions from her relentless attempts to free her cubs alone. The mental toll might have been greater still, having forced herself to suppress every natural reflex, to expose herself to mortal danger from the enemy she'd been born to fear, to stand still as strangers touched her young. Yet as she watched Tyner and Sylvie grow stronger with each passing moment, their tiny forms nestled against her, she knew she would pay that price again without a heartbeat's hesitation. The hunters remained at a respectful distance, their faces etched with awe as they beheld one of nature's most potent forces. A mother's love, unyielding and boundless. They had seen something few humans ever would, a wild creature choosing trust over fear, intelligence over instinct, defying the boundaries of her kind to save her own. Tharvan, the one who had first understood her plea, watched the family with quiet amazement, his grizzled hands resting on his knees. In all his years stalking these mountains, tracking game and facing down predators, he had never witnessed such a pure display of maternal courage. A strength that went beyond muscle and claw, rooted in a devotion that reshaped the world around it. As strength returned to her cubs, their small bodies growing steadier with each sip of milk, Karina faced her final challenge. She needed to lead her family away from this place of trauma, back to the safety of their forest home where the scent of pine and the rustle of leaves would erase the memory of cold metal and suffocating dark. Rising slowly, her movements stiff with pain, she kept Tyner and Sylvie sheltered beneath her bulk, her massive head swinging to gaze one last time at the humans who had helped her. Her eyes held no fear now, only a deep, unshakable awareness that would forever alter how she viewed their kind, a recognition of a bond forged in the crucible of desperation. The hunters watched as she guided her cubs into the forest, Tyner stumbling over a root and Sylvie batting playfully at his tail, their steps tentative but growing surer. Carina moved with purpose despite her wounds, her silhouette fading into the lengthening shadows of the trees. They knew this encounter would ripple beyond this moment. Word would spread through the hunting community, carried on the wind to cabins and campfires, tales of the grizzly bear who had sought human aid, who had demonstrated a trust and intelligence that upended everything they thought they knew about the wild. Carina paused at the forest's edge, her cubs tumbling around her legs, their ordeal already slipping from their young minds, replaced by the simple joy of being near her. She turned to look back at the humans one final time, her amber gaze steady, as if etching this moment into her memory. A peaceful pause between danger and safety, between trust and the wild freedom that awaited her. She stood there, framed by the towering pines, a testament to the incredible power of maternal love, a force that had bent nature's rules, defied its laws, and bridged a gap no one thought could be crossed. The hunters returned to their cabin that evening, forever changed, their steps heavy with the weight of what they'd witnessed. They had seen love conquer the deepest instinctive fears, bridge chasms that nature itself had carved, creating a moment of understanding that none of them would ever forget. A fleeting unity between species forged by a mother's desperate heart. As darkness settled over the mountain, cloaking the peaks in shadow, Carina led Tyner and Sylvie to a sheltered den far from the shaft, a hollow beneath a gnarled oak where the earth was soft and the air thick with the scent of moss. Her wounds would heal in time, the pain of those desperate days fading into scars, but the memory would endure. A reminder of what a mother would risk for her children, a story written in her flesh and spirit. Tyner and Sylvie would grow strong under her watchful eye, their small forms stretching into the powerful bears they were born to become, carrying with them an inherited wisdom about humans that few of their kind would ever know, a legacy of trust born from their mother's courage. The tale of Carina, the grizzly who trusted humans to save her cubs, would echo around hunting cabin fires for years to come, retold in hushed tones over flickering flames. It would remind those who heard it that nature's creatures were capable of far more than humans often suspected, depths of emotion, acts of bravery, bonds that defied the wild's harsh code. Most of all, it would stand as an eternal testament to the courage of mothers everywhere, who would risk everything, defy any obstacle, break any natural law to save their children. Their love a force stronger than fear, stronger than instinct, stronger than the mountains themselves. In the seasons that followed, hunters in those rugged peaks might occasionally glimpse a large grizzly bear with distinctive scars weaving through the trees, teaching her growing cubs the ways of the forest, how to fish the streams, how to strip bark for grubs, how to scent the wind for danger. Carina would acknowledge their presence with a calm tilt of her head before leading her family deeper into the wild, no longer ruled by the blind fear that had once defined her kind's view of humans. In that simple gesture lived the legacy of her bravery, a quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest act of love is trusting those we were born to fear, a lesson carved into the fabric of her life and passed to her cubs like a whispered secret of the wild. If this incredible tale of Carina's courage touched your heart, don't miss more inspiring wildlife stories. Subscribe to our Nature's Chronicles newsletter for weekly narratives that showcase the extraordinary bonds between animals, their incredible survival instincts, and heartwarming encounters in the wild, tales that reveal the hidden depths of the natural world and the forces that shape it.